Hello, beautiful people. So good to have you here with us today on The Brief, our weekly show about politics. I am Carrie Eleveld, and I'm hosting today because Marcos Malitzis is off. He's doing some traveling and business type stuff, top secret. Who knows, but something. He's doing something. So I'm hosting today. I have a great guest with us today. This is Zachary Mueller. He's the Senior Research Director for America's Voice. And we are going to talk immigration politics. This is what America's Voice covers. It's their area of expertise. And one of the reasons that I have asked Zachary to join us today is that I was looking, let's see, in February, I think, or actually it was probably March. In March, I was looking at this Gallup polling that showed that immigration had once again topped the list of issues that voters were looking at, right? So I'm looking at this Gallup poll. It's from February, and it has, the number of people who say their top issue is immigration at 28%. Second is government at 20%. And then third is the economy in general at 12%. So, whoa, immigration suddenly at 28%, not quite a third, but nearly a third of people saying this is their top issue. Huh. So I reached out to America's Voice, and Zachary says, sure, let me put some numbers together for you on how much advertising Republicans are doing on this topic. And in the first 2 months of February, it turned out that the amount of money Republicans had poured into the issue of immigration was at $62.6 million over the first 2 months. So a little over $30 million for the first 2 months each, right? And I mean, let's just remember something. The Republican Party is not particularly rich at the moment, right? Trump isn't raising money hand over fist. Of course, there's always super PAC dollars and stuff like that. But like the Republican Party is just not awash in money at the moment. But it is super important to keep this issue top of mind. And then that took the Gallup polling that I was looking at and took it from being a story about how immigration was sort of organically rising to the top for people and turned it into a story about how Republicans who don't have a whole lot of good things to run on are pushing abortion to the very top, to the fore of voters' minds, because this is their play. This is their desperation play. They really need to run on it. So, Zachary, let me ask you: have they suddenly has the money that the Republican Party is pouring into this issue suddenly dropped off? Are they like, oh no, it's no big deal?
Oh, no, not absolutely not. So what we've seen actually from this year, I took a look before we hopped on. We've got about $102 million that Republican and Republican aligned candidates and campaigns and PACs have spent just this year in this cycle on anti-immigrant attacks on TV and CTV spending. So that's not even accounting all the different Facebook ads and all of the other kind of organic content that they're pushing out on a daily basis to really drive this issue as kind of a cornerstone issue that they're making for campaigns, from Donald Trump all the way down to dog catcher. Everybody's got something on the Republican side to say nasty about immigrants and blaming, for their problems, from whether or not it's, can you get a good job or afford health care, or, do you find your place in the world, or if it's raining or you stubbed your toe in the morning, right? To the Republican ads, it's immigrants' fault that did all of that.
Yeah. I stubbed my toe this morning, and I thought, you know what? Those immigrants. This
Mm-hmm.
is it's a bad situation. I mean,
Yep.
come on. Well, I tell you what. So this is not new, right? This is a
Mm-hmm.
play that Republicans have been running for the past, few years at least. I mean, I feel like they get on this they get on this rant about immigrants like basically every election cycle, and
Hmm.
it's only a matter of magnitude and if it's dialed back a little bit or if it's, if it's not. I mean, it
Hmm.
is, we all remember that Trump, when he came down that elevator in 2015 to announce his presidential contest, said a lot of
Hmm.
really, like, tragically gross things about
Hmm.
immigrants and, Mexicans and, basically people with brown skin. They
Hmm.
were bad news. And he, and at the time, everyone was like, oh my god, this guy is a nut job. Okay, well, he's still
Hmm.
a nut job. He just managed to win the 2016 election and then was our president for, 4 years as a nut job. But when
Hmm.
you look at what Republicans are doing now on this issue, at a I don't want to say it's an early stage, but it's a relatively early stage. Like I remember in 2018, for instance, all of a sudden, like a month or two before, and you probably remember this better than I do, but a month or two before those midterms, which Republicans just got blown out in, right? This was during
Hmm.
Trump's years, first 4 years as president, right? Let's
Hmm.
just not say first 4 years. That's a terrible thing to say. Let's just say during his 4 years of presidents as president, right? Um,
Hmm.
but and then those final 2 months, all of a sudden, he didn't talk about anything but caravans, right? Because
Hmm.
caravans of immigrants were gonna be the reason that he could stave off the blue wave that eventually washed over the country because everybody, all the voters who couldn't stand Trump got to the polls to have their say, and it was a
Hmm.
blowout, right? But
Hmm.
does this at this, relatively early stage strike you as anything different, or is it just par for the course for the Republican Party?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good summary, and I think it's also inform like I think it's good to remind ourselves as well too that it wasn't just the reaction to and the failure of the embrace of anti-immigrant rhetoric as a campaign issue that failed in 2018. We should all remember the horrible family separation policy that the administration, talked about being cruel to immigrants and then implemented it, and then Americans all across the country poured out into the streets by the hundreds of thousands to protest those ideas. And I think really that showed up in the election cycle. And we don't see that just actually in 2018. We've got receipts from 2017, 2019, and what have you. Ever since they won the election in 2016, they've been convinced that doubling down on anti-immigrant rhetoric in campaigns is the silver bullet from them. But up until 2016, every election since, it has not worked for them. I mean, we have seen over and over and over again that this massive investment, like we're talking about for this year, $100 million just in TV ads on this issue. It's a massive investment that has not paid off for Republicans getting actual power. And I think that's a rejection from the American people for that kind of vitriol, that extremism that they're seeing. And to answer your question more specifically, I do think that this is a pattern that we've been seeing over the last several years, but it is a pattern that has been escalating. And while it may seem, oh, this is Donald Trump just being Donald Trump, same old, Republicans hating on immigrants. They've been hating on immigrants for years. We know that. But really, I think it's important to take a step back to kind of see the slow movement of which that they're normalizing each little bit of the kind of dehumanizing rhetoric, the kind of ability to say that immigrants are a threat to our nation as an existential threat. That kind of normalization over these last several years is hard to notice in the day to day, but I think in the context, we can kind of see where we're at. So obviously, the amount of outrage that we saw in the headlines when Donald Trump first came down the escalator, as you mentioned, right? There was everyone was like, "Oh, this is racist," right? Like everybody was shocked by the kind of language that he was engaged in. But he will say things today that are much worse. That like we're talking about like where he is echoing the language of Nazis, talking about immigrants poisoning the blood. And that's not just me saying that. That's the New York Times describing what he's saying as echoing Nazis and despots, some of the worst people in human history. And we can see, right, like that kind of escalation over these years, I think is really important for us to really hit on. So
Yep.
I was looking at this the other day, right? Even thinking about 2018, you might remember the Brian Kemp ads from Georgia, where he had this ad talking about how he was going to round up, quote unquote illegals in his big truck, and that got coverage in CNN. It was written up as this is a fringe candidate in the New York Times. But what we see in the ads today, actually, like, that's pretty tame compared to what is actually in these millions of dollars of ad spending and the kind of rhetoric that we see and the descriptions of migrants with more and more dehumanizing rhetoric and more violent rhetoric and conspiratorial rhetoric over these last several years. So I think the long-winded way to say that, right, is that it is similar in the pattern, but I think we need to be attuned to that this is actually getting worse. And if it isn't stopped, if there isn't pushback on it, it will actually continue to escalate. And the one thing I am confident of predicting for these next several months is the rhetoric from Republicans on immigration will continue to get worse up until November.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is, I mean, to your point, this is such a classic despot's playbook, right? A fascist playbook, authoritarian playbook to dehumanize a segment of society and
Mm-hmm.
then, blame everything on them. And
Mm-hmm.
and then it makes it okay to do just about whatever you want because you've dehumanized them over a period of years and,
Mm-hmm.
constantly hitting these points in order to dehumanize people to the point where, a certain segment of your followers, if not, most of your followers, don't see those people as human anymore, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
you can do whatever you want because you have sort of the moral authority in the view of you and your followers to do that, to take those actions, however horrific they are, right? And one
Mm-hmm.
thing I like to say about fascism is um, it comes knocking on everybody's door at some point, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they may
Yep.
start with the immigrants, or they may, the Nazis started with the Jews, or whatever it is. And then
Mm-hmm.
eventually it broadens out. It's the intellectuals, it's the
Mm-hmm.
LGBTQ people, the gay people, it's the transgender
Mm-hmm.
people, it's anyone with brown skin, it's anyone with black
Mm-hmm.
skin, it's anyone who's not white, Christian, or male. I mean, these are like, and
Mm-hmm.
pretty soon you get down, but like they come for someone else first, and then
Mm-hmm.
they come knocking on everybody else's door eventually, right? So um
Yeah, and I
let
think what's
yeah.
no, I think what's just important about that, right, is that, like, I think what we're seeing with some of these anti-immigrant ads, right, and we're in these anti-immigrant attacks, is that I think it's important for us to remember. I think as you powerfully put it, is that this isn't just about hate and vitriol or cruelty towards immigrants. This isn't just about an immigrant policy. What we're seeing in these ads, what we're seeing in this campaign, isn't just about immigrants. It's an argument for who we are and who gets to be an American. And if you don't subscribe to the MAGA agenda, well, then you could never be American enough. I mean, even how they're attacking, DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, and going after him, and even in some of the attacks against him, calling for his quote unquote deportation, saying, going after the first immigrant Jewish candidate for who to open up, who was running the DHS office, right? Somebody who has dedicated his whole life to service and protection of this country. For the Republican Party, they're demonizing of him. They're using of the Great Replacement theory and the invasion rhetoric to attack the Jewish immigrant DHS secretary, right? No matter how much you give to your public service, right? Well, he can never actually be American enough for them. And I think
Right.
that's what's important here for us to think about, that this isn't, oh, we need to push back on anti-immigrant attacks because, well, that's good for our moral selves. But I think it's about an understanding about who we are as a country and who gets to be part of it. And do we actually believe in a pluralistic democracy where everybody gets to participate in that. And I think that's really what we're seeing in some of these anti-immigrant attacks is something using those anti-immigrant attacks as a bit of a Trojan horse to push forward really nefarious policies, anti-democratic policies that affect all of us, regardless of our immigration status or what communities we're a part of.
Right. And when you say DHS, just for our listeners, that's the Department of Homeland Security. So that's
Yes.
Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, who has been impeached by the House Republicans, and I'm pretty sure that impeachment's going straight to the Senate to die now. So because
Hmm.
there was no there. Um, but
Hmm.
but they needed, but look, they had to create an issue, and this is what they do, right? This is what
Hmm.
Republicans do. They need to create an issue. Let's real quick cut and listen a second to Donald Trump. I was going to do this one last, but let's listen to Donald Trump, because we were talking about the escalation of rhetoric, right? And Trump
Hmm.
has said any number of really heinous racist things over the years. When I heard him say this, it made me stop for a beat and think, oh my God. And this is him talking. Let me just set it up a second, set up this clip. He is standing in front of a some several uniformed law enforcement officers. He's giving a press conference. Actually can't remember at the moment exactly where it was, but he's giving a press conference. It happened within the last month or so. And he's talking about a really tragic murder of Laken Riley, who was a 22-year-old nursing student at Augusta University College. And the person arrested for that murder very recently was a Venezuelan man who was an undocumented immigrant and was allowed to stay in the country to pursue his immigration case. Okay, so he's been arrested for that murder. But what Trump does is take this murder and then basically blows that tragic case up into all immigrants, undocumented immigrants are terrible and threatening and are going to commit heinous crimes, etc. Okay, so let's listen to the clip real quick.
The 22-year-old nursing student in Georgia who was barbarically murdered by an illegal alien animal. The Democrats say, please don't call them animals. They're humans. I said, no, they're not humans. They're not humans. They're animals. And Nancy Pelosi told me that. She said, please don't use the word animal, sir, when you're talking about these people. I said, I'll use the word animal because that's what they are. I'll never forget my vow to her.
Right. So how many times did he, was it 3 or 4 times that he worked in the word animal along with illegal
Hmm.
alien, because that wasn't bad enough. He needed to add the
Hmm.
animal part of it. And this is like we just talked about, this is just classic. It's right out of the playbook of an authoritarian leader to do something like this. If you want to just riff
Hmm.
on that for a second.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not just us saying that this is dehumanizing is a problem. I think all of the recent history and longer history, the scientific and academic research shows that animalistic dehumanization of outgroups or disfavored minorities creates a climate for political violence, and that is what he is doing. And he's creating an active case for political violence for his own selfish political ends. And I think we need to be very clear about the danger that poses when he is engaging in that sort of rhetoric and what that means, and saying that there are people among us that we cannot trust, that we cannot be safe. And I think you are exactly right to say that this is a well-tired and trodden out playbook of authoritarians, of fascists, of despots, and demagogues for years and years and years that we have seen from decades and histories past, that we should be very aware of what's happening here, to name it, and not name it just as a means to say this is bad, but for us to understand the real threat and the stakes of what we are dealing with here, about if this man has access to power and what it means as a society when we in civic society do not condemn this sort of rhetoric, and name it. I think what's also, I don't want to say worse, but I think what is something that we talked about, what is new, is that one is the rhetoric of which that he's engaged in. I think the level of animalistic rhetoric, right? That is, I think, not entirely new from Donald Trump, but the regularity of which it is coming from him is new. But also the lack and complete utter silence from the Republican Party, from any dissenting voice inside of that party to say, hold on, wait a minute, like this is too far. We can disagree over policies about immigration. Like that's what a democracy is, right? We can disagree. But when we are engaged in rhetoric that courts political violence, we've crossed a threshold into something much different that requires all of us to condemn. And I think what we've also seen is that on Twitter, or X, formerly known as Twitter, a formal outfit of the GOP, the RNC's research outfit, uplifted that very clip and then said this is actually an insult to animals. So this is from the official organ of the GOP that is doubling down on this sort of rhetoric. And so it's across the board. So it's not just an isolated individual at the moment, but the level of which that this is elevating across this throughout the political discourse really only continues to court that political violence that is metered out and puts a target on the backs, not just of immigrant communities, but anybody associated with immigrant communities or other communities that are disfavored, that some white nationalist individual with hate in their heart and gun in their hands thinks that they are not truly American. We've seen that from African Americans who were targeted and murdered in Buffalo almost 2 years ago. We've seen that targeted in Pittsburgh with the Jewish community. We've seen in El Paso with Latinos at the Walmart, where violent white nationalists murdered individuals. Or we see, some of these same ideas with the murder of a white woman in Charlottesville, who was deigned to stand up to these ideas even before they got into the mainstream. And so I think it's really important that we see this stuff, and it's really gross. It's really disgusting. And it's really hard, I think, not to turn away and to say, I don't want to deal with that, right? Like that's difficult. And I understand there are not moments that we can all look at all times, but I think it is really important that we not look away from what is happening here to start to really see the language that he is using and that the GOP is using, and not just to say, oh, we've been here, done this. We survived Trump once before, we can do it again. Because I think what we have seen over the last several years is that this is going to continue to get worse. And the resistance on our ability to resist that is going to be diminished over time as well.
Yeah. I had not realized until you just said it that the Republican Party had on Twitter, on social media, had lifted that up as an insult, that clip from Trump as an insult to animals. I mean, that is just gross. Like, it couldn't be. I'm like kind of at a loss for words about what a horrific statement that is. But I want to ask though, but then the other thing that happens, I think, once you start dehumanizing people, once you take one example and then you blow it up as being a problem writ large that like sort of affects everybody, and you can't be safe, and anyone who's undocumented is going to be a threat to society, that type of thing. Once you do that, then your followers become predisposed to believing anything that they hear, right? So just before we came on here, you and I were talking in the green room, and you were talking about how that Marjorie Taylor Greene right now, the Heritage Foundation, okay, which is this ultra conservative, like right-wing think tank, put out this nonsense about, so I don't even know. I can't even remember. Yeah, I'm going to let you take it. But the point, people are listening to this, I just want people to understand that what happens is, Republicans prosecute that this idea that anyone with brown skin, anyone, and anyone undocumented immigrant, but let's be clear, they're talking about immigrants with brown skin, is a threat to society, right? And then they can like just kind of run wild with that idea. So tell us a little bit about what the Heritage Foundation put out, and then what Republicans in Congress were like. We're recording this on Tuesday. We're doing this. How they were using this piece of misinformation, or I should call it disinformation, because it's very clearly like it's not. It's not like they accidentally misunderstood something. It's disinformation that they're spreading. They put it out, and then Republicans on the Hill take it up and start using it there. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So yesterday would have been Monday, the 15th. Heritage Foundation, as you noted, is a far right conservative think tank, and moving further to the farther fringes of the rights, and has been the kind of key holder of this Project 2025, which is a blueprint for what a Trump administration would look like. So they play a pivotal role. So this isn't just some Yahoo in their basement spouting off, but somebody with a lot of pull. And one of their projects, one of their organizational entities, shared this clip of supposedly this flyer, a doctored flyer, at a camp in Matamoros in Mexico. So allegedly hanging in porta potties, that was encouraging immigrants, if they were in the United States, to vote for Joe Biden. And that was on this flyer, which you had misspellings, bad translations of Spanish, that had a Biden logo just kind of attached to it as well. So even, Bill Malugin of Fox News was on Twitter being like, anybody would take a passing glance at this would see that this is fake. And that's somebody who is happily on the border, trafficking these kind of ideas on a regular basis. Even to him, it was like, this doesn't even pass the smell test. Not going to uplift that. So that's kind of the baseline that we're dealing with. But then this is shared by like massive social media platforms on the right, to huge followings. So the libs of TikTok, kind of this far right influencer, to Laura Loomer, another far right influencer. Lots of other far right influencers are uplifting and sharing these this kind of false disinformation that we see. That's kind of a replacement theory argument. And not only is it a replacement theory argument just that says that migrants are going to be voting, in the flyer, they accuse a Jewish organization of facilitating this. So the kind of anti-Semitic, kind of white nationalist conspiracy theories that's in this disinformation is being circulated online. Then in a committee hearing.
Let's just say real quick that replacement theory is this really racist idea that white Christian voters essentially are being replaced by people who don't belong, shouldn't be voting. Anyone who doesn't share the right, whatever the right characteristics are, genetic characteristics, etc. So replacement theory is, and I'm not doing it justice, but it's this idea that basically white heterosexual Christian voters are being replaced by other voters. Okay, so sorry, go ahead. I just wanted to point that out.
No, thank you. Yeah, I'm immersed in some of this stuff, and so it kind of is the back in my head. But yeah, I think you're right. So it is really, I think, in a small crux is the idea that there is an intentional plot by Democrats, Jews, elites, globalists to bring in non-white migrants or other non-whites to replace the voting power of white or quote unquote real Americans. And that idea, I think, has inspired those mass murders and domestic terrorist attacks from Buffalo, El Paso, and Pittsburgh that we mentioned, and continues to animate different white nationalists as well as the Republican Party. So that's kind of the idea that's being promulgated in this kind of conspiratorial disinformation flyer. But in a hearing today, in a congressional hearing, and acting in their official congressional capacity, Representative Dan Bishop from North Carolina has a big blow up of this clearly fake flyer that he is engaging in questioning the Department of Homeland Security, DHS's Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, in front of this committee, asking him about this flyer. He even acknowledges in his opening that the organization this is credit to has denied that this is their flyer, but then proceeds to show the flyer itself, then ask the DHS secretary about this idea of non-citizen voting. Another kind of fraudulent idea that there is somehow an effort of folks that are not able to vote, who are non-citizens, in elections to corrupt the election process. Part of the kind of stop the steal, this kind of idea of election deniers, and feeding that idea, even though there's no evidence of that whatsoever. Then Marjorie Taylor Greene follows right up, has another big blow up of this clearly misinformed flyer. And they're presenting this as something that is real and quote unquote evidence of this plot that there is Democrats and others are engaged in to have non-citizens, to have immigrants, to have non-white individuals pollute the democratic process, and therefore we can't trust the ballot box. So this is part of an ongoing piece of evidence that they have, quote unquote evidence, where therefore their supporters will think, oh, well, we heard about this flyer this one time. Well, we can't trust elections that we don't win because of the plot by Democrats to have non-white immigrants vote. And it's really pernicious in a way, I think, that links back to an earlier part of our conversation, that this isn't just about demonizing immigrants, but it is a pretext to create voter suppression efforts, to undermine and set up a kind of a January 6 2.0 by laying the foundation for their supporters that we cannot actually trust elections that they don't like. And I think that kind of pernicious idea building over time in their supporters, I think is really important for us to identify and to name, but it is a really encapsulation of where the GOP is at, which is taking fake ideas about immigrants combined with fake flyers that they made up to advance this to their own base, to create this fiction that that we don't actually need to have a democracy anymore, that we should actually have something that is the will of the MAGA base be the only thing that is dictating our country. And I think what that looks like from their agenda has far-reaching implications well beyond immigrant policy, that I think is about the livelihoods of which we have for access to good and affordable jobs, to bodily autonomy, to many, many, many more issues. That I think that that's what's at the crux of this, that we see kind of this absurdity in Congress the last throughout today.
So let's just call this down. So when the MAGA, if November comes and goddess willing, Joe Biden prevails, right, and the MAGA Republicans who are predisposed to violence already in many, many polls, using violence, saying that is a legitimate form of political discourse, as the Republican Party once said of the January 6th riot, right? So if they don't get their way in November, then they can all say, yeah, I saw that, there were some Mexicans who saw a urinal, a thing on a urinal saying that I should go vote for Joe Biden. So that's what I did. And that's what happened. That's what happened in this, in this election, is that the Mexicans who saw that on some urinal then crossed the border and voted for Joe Biden, and therefore the entire election is illegal. I mean, it's just preposterous. But I mean, I'm half laughing about it. It's horrific, but it's so preposterous. But it is, it is the thinking. I mean, even though we call it down, and when you think about it like that, the direct link between this urinal posting and the idea that somehow the election could be subverted by people who can't legally vote feels like insanity. But before we close out here, because we're coming to sort of the end here, and I know you have things to go do, and I'm on the hook for another story today. So but tell me a little bit about the polling on this. I mean, do we see in the polling that things are, that this version of the party's version of what's happening on immigration and whatever is taking hold, has affected people's view of whether or not there should be a legal pathway to citizenship for the some 11 million undocumented immigrants who are already in the country, that type of thing. Like, how are you seeing this play out in the polling? And there is a legitimate issue on the border where there's far too many people, seeking asylum for the number of asylum judges we have. There's horrific conditions at the border for people who are waiting to have their hearings adjudicated, things like that. But, what are we seeing in the polling about this issue as it relates to the upcoming election?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So I think what we see, right, is even after, as we kind of bring it back to the very beginning, that after this massive, massive investment from the Republicans to demonize immigrants, we have seen a consistent level of support for a vast majority that is pro-immigrant in this country. And that remains the case overwhelmingly. And I think what's important here, right, is a number of things. So one is that folks, I think, broadly speaking, want a both and approach. What that means is both a approach to security at the border, and what I think folks really want is they don't want chaos. They know that there is a problem at the border by just there's global migration, that there's a challenge that we need to deal with, and then folks want to see that there is somebody minding the store, somebody who is engaged in making this a safe, orderly, and humane process. So I think there is a lot of, and that shows up, I think, in a kind of a border security language, because that's what folks know and that's what they hear. But at the same time, there's also a strong majority that wants a pathway to citizenship for our undocumented neighbors, the ones that have been long settled here. And so I think there is a both and approach that we really need to think about moving forward, that there is a broad consensus. And that consensus actually is even 30% of the Republican Party base primary voters. Now, that may not seem like a lot of a huge percentage, but added to the rest of the population, that adds and builds up to that solid 60% majority that want this kind of both and approach. And how we know that is we looked at the polling, not the exit polling out of the primaries in the GOP presidential primary. And from New Hampshire to South Carolina to California and several other states, there was consistently a 30% of people who were turning out in a Republican presidential primary that said, I want a pathway to citizenship, to the question of immigration. And that's a key, complete distinction from where the rest of the Republican Party's platform is, where Trump's platform is, and what they are talking about. And why I think that's important is I think it goes back to a bit of what you were talking about at the start around this Gallup poll. As we look at where the number of people are saying that immigration is a top issue, if we uncover those numbers a little bit, overwhelmingly, that is driven by Republican-based voters. And so there is a segment of this country that has bought into the idea that immigration is an existential threat to our country. They're wrong. But we're not going to get those folks. But they're not coming with us. They're voting for Donald Trump. But that is not a majority. And there might be deep ruby red districts where they operate as a large voting percentage. But for most battleground races and for larger statewide races, and especially the presidential level, there isn't the majority that has that kind of vitriol towards immigrants. They care about lots of other issues. They like their immigrant neighbors. They like going to eat immigrant food, when they go out to eat. Folks, and that majority is there. And I think we have seen that consistently in the polling as that shows up, that overwhelmingly, that voters, when given the option, prefer the alternative to a kind of extremist policy that we've seen from Donald Trump and Republicans. And I think that's even going to probably be more the case the more they learn how extreme the Trump administration or an administration with the Trump campaign is proposing a second administration would be, in showing the actual level of what that would mean for the daily lives of working families across the country, regardless of their immigration status.
Right. I tell you, I don't have to get out the cross tabs on those polls that you're talking about with the in the Republican primary, where roughly 30% of Republican, even people who vote, Republicans who voted in those primaries. In some cases, they weren't Republicans, but in a lot of cases, they were. It depended on which state you're talking about. But anyway, that roughly third or a little under that group of voters that voted that said that they supported legal immigration, a pathway to citizenship, those are Nikki Haley voters, right? I can't tell you the exact percentage, but I guarantee you that a majority of the Republican voters who said that they supported a pathway to citizenship were also the type of people who would have voted for Nikki Haley. And as we know, some portion of that group was also said, like in Iowa, 41% of Haley supporters told one of the pollsters, one of the very good pollsters, Ann Seltzer, that they were actually, I think it was 43% that they would vote for Joe Biden if Trump became the Republican nominee, right? So these are voters who are open to number one, they support, even in the Republican Party, they support a pathway to citizenship. It's not a majority of the Republican Party, but it's the group of voters that's open to a pitch from Joe Biden about voting for him in November. The Biden campaign is making that pitch. And on the many, in the many ways that, where the many places where the Biden campaign has an opening to make that pitch is on, this is just inhumane what Republicans are talking about. I mean, what Donald Trump is talking about, and we should end, but this is like a whole nother, but what Donald Trump is talking about is that he is going to preside over a massive, a massive deportation scheme of all undocumented immigrants who are here. And I just want to say, as a way of ending this, not, particularly fun conversation in a lot of ways, if Donald Trump is elected and he indeed will set in motion with Stephen Miller, like as his top deputy, presiding over this massive deportation plan, I guarantee you that it will also catch within that scheme of that deportation scheme, people who are not undocumented, people who are accidentally get caught up in this whole, massive deportation scheme and actually probably just don't have the right color skin or something that, puts them, in the crosshairs somehow. And, they get deported. So now it's going to be the most draconian, incompetent deportation scheme that you have ever seen on a massive scale. And I guarantee you that legal residents, that potentially American citizens will also get caught up in that. And I'm not saying that that's worse. I'm just telling people that this is what's going to happen if Donald Trump presides over what he has said he will be doing, which is a massive deportation of the undocumented immigrants who are here in the States. So I want to, I should let you have the last word, but I'm not going to, Zachary. I'm not going to do I feel like we need to get out of this now that I've ended on that very, happy note. But I just want to say to the folks that have joined us, I want to thank you for listening to us. Please, if you like what we do, and we hardly ever ask this, but I'm going to start asking, if you like what we do here on the Daily Kos The Brief, please go and rate us on your favorite platform, whatever it is. Give us a review. If you don't like us, skip it. Don't do it. Don't give us that 1 star. go like get a coffee or something. Just don't do it. But anyway, I also want to thank Zachary Mueller, Senior Research Director for America's Voice, for joining me talking about these issues. They are doing incredible work. They track all of these ads. Zachary Mueller has watched probably like every one of these incredibly dehumanizing, gross ads that the Republican Party has put out, and manages to still be a level-headed, good-humored individual, and we appreciate that about him and him joining us. And for all of you, take good care. Please join us next week. We will be back with another episode. We are not sure what the topic is going to be, but I wouldn't be surprised if it involved Donald Trump or abortion. Who knows? Or immigration. I plan to do more on immigration. But we will see you next time. And thank you for joining us today.